right. Our main speaker today is David Berg. He's regarded as one of the nation's leading trial lawyers, and he's also the author of 2 books, including his memoir, Run, Brother, Run, and has published many essays and articles in major media nationwide. So please welcome to our screen, David Berg.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And thank you for inviting me this morning. And it says here the host has spotlighted my video for everyone. Can you give me an idea of how many people we're addressing or I'm addressing now?
At least 47.
Well, I don't see all of you, but I'm glad to be here with kindred spirits. I was saying earlier that my son, Jeffrey, whom I believe has spoken to you before, describes our family, including my theologian wife, as 4 asshole atheists and 1 decent Christian woman. So I'm glad to be here speaking to you today. I received an email. I received an email earlier from someone in charge of the speaking, and it mentioned that I should rehearse what I'm going to say to you today, because you don't want to find yourself doing a lot of ums and uhs. And it put me in mind of a story that I tell in my memoir, and I like to tell that story to you. It especially hit home. My mother was the first woman to have a radio show of her own in Arkansas. And I grew up in Little Rock until I was 11 and then came to Houston. And she was on radio station KLRA. She had a show that was called Homemaker's Harmony, until she introduced it one day as Homemaker's Hominy, and they changed the name to Meet Millie. She was, of course, on the air live. She would have discussions with some of our neighbors. If I got in a fist fight with somebody, she'd talk to their mother on air. So she did not have script like everyone else. They had no copy that she could follow. And they had something called the fluff box. It was a little tin box with a slot at the top. And every time you said or ah on air, you had to drop a quarter in the box. We didn't have many quarters. So Mom brought home a fluff box to our house. And every time I would say or ah, or she would say or ah, we would put a quarter in the fluff box at home. And then, of course, immediately take it out, because you could actually buy a hamburger for a quarter then. Now, as a result of that training, if I'm in a closing argument and I hear myself say or ah, I immediately think back to the fluff box and get back on track. So without further ado, let me just say, let me move to something that is of interest to everyone. I was just going to talk to you today about the case that my firm filed against Trump, Postmaster General DeJoy, and the United States Post Office for these changes that they've accelerated and instituted that have created a downward spiral on timely delivery of mail. Before I get to that, I'm going to start my stopwatch here. If someone can give me a warning in about 10 minutes. I want to take a moment to discuss the political, moral, and theological implications of the death of Justice Ginsburg. When I first heard it, I was shell-shocked, as were many of the members of my family, all of the members of my immediate family. And a friend of mine, a journalist, asked me for my opinion about what's going to happen next. I thought about it overnight. I didn't want to give him a hurried opinion. And as I began to think about it, context began to emerge. I'm just laughing because I see my laundry you can all see my laundry in the background there. I did close the door to the bathroom, however. What now is all-out war over nominees to the Supreme Court began with skirmishes back in the days of Nixon. In 1970 or 71, Justice Abe Fortas, LBJ's lawyer, was forced from the bench by what is now referred to as a conflict of interest. He took a bribe. He began to lobby at the SEC on behalf of a convicted stock swindler, a guy named Lewis Wolfson. And it is of such events that history is made. First, Nixon tried to nominate two Southerners, one named Carswell and the other named Hainsworth. Both of them were, at one time at least, segregationists, especially Carswell. And Nixon had to withdraw those nominations. One of them was defeated, I believe, Carswell, by a vote of something like 55 to 45, because then it took a supermajority of 60 votes in the Senate to confirm a presidential appointee. The battle heightened. In the late 80s or mid 80s, Robert Bork, an ultra-conservative originalist, as they are called, was nominated to the US Supreme Court. Bork was a brilliant man. Ted Kennedy killed that nomination with a brilliant and totally unnecessary speech, condemning Carswell very personally for his inability to say during his nominations that he would have voted in favor of Brown v. Board of Education. I'd say it was unnecessary because with that testimony, he simply was not going to make it. And what became skirmishes elevated into all-out war. And nominations rarely go easily. Ginsburg was nominated by President Clinton and was approved 94 to nothing, despite making clear her actual opinion about women's rights and the right to abortion. Just parenthetically, she was a critic of Roe v. Wade. She thought that holding should have been limited to the Texas law that was declared unconstitutional and let the states grow into that holding. That actually created some opposition among feminist groups. But she turned out to be, I think she's right historically. That opinion and Bush v. Gore are two opinions that are subjected to a great deal of intellectual criticism. Be that as it may, here we are. And now all nominations become war. Kavanaugh, the most recent example, Thomas in years past. I don't think either one of those men should have made it to the court, but we used to pay huge deference to a presidential nominee. Justice Ginsburg is one example. She surely offended the political views and legal views of many Republicans, and yet the vote was 94 to nothing. And what do we get as a result of these wars? They may be righteous, but we have Clarence Thomas, who's an avowed enemy of liberal thought, and Justice Kavanaugh, whom I happen to think, having read his opinions, might have been a little more flexible on the court had he not been demonized. The end product takes us to where we are now. And what I think will happen, it is clear to me that with weasel words like those of Senator Collins in Maine, so famous for wringing her hands and saying, "Oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. Justice Kavanaugh, I've got grave doubts about him," but she voted for him. That to me is indicative of why she said yesterday, in a typical Susan Collins head fake, Republicans should not vote on a nominee until after the election. They're going to get their nominee. They're going to get their right-wing court, which brings me to a thought that I heard from a well-known journalist, a dear friend of mine, about 3 years ago, who said that we have to pack the court. We've got to expand the court to gain the balance. Now, why? You might blame Mitch McConnell, and he's not blameless. He sees power. He sees influence far before he's ever guided by principle. Now, how did that happen? It started with Harry Reid, Senator Harry Reid, the Democrat from Nevada, who was the Senate Majority Leader in 2013 during President Obama's presidency. And he decided to use what's called the nuclear option, which I'm sure many of you know. The nuclear option blew up the requirement of a Senate supermajority, 60 votes to confirm a nominee, and allowed the nominees to be confirmed by a simple majority. And at the time, and I think that was during Justice Kagan's uh, confirmation hearings. It may not be, but it was during the time that Obama was going to make an appointment. McConnell told Reid from the floor of the Senate on the day that Reid exploded the supermajority and required only a majority. He said, "My time will come. Our time will come. And I want you to know it's going to come sooner than you think." And I'm paraphrasing and probably making McConnell a bit more loquacious than he actually is, if not certainly more eloquent. And the day came. And not too many years ago, McConnell expanded that requirement of a majority to Supreme Court nominees. Reid hadn't done that. That was the only executive appointment that he had reserved a supermajority for, that he said we still need a supermajority. And now here we are. Can't blame McConnell entirely. You got to look to Harry Reid. Again, short-sighted and mean-spirited. I had an experience with him once, totally humorous guy. Back in 2008, if I can digress a bit, we raised a lot of money for Republicans. No, not for Republicans. That is actually not something I've ever done. I was brought up to believe Republicans were a species born without opposable thumbs. But back then, we raised a bunch of money for the Democratic Senate campaign. My old buddy, Lee Godfrey at Sussman and Godfrey. And I was in a room with a bunch of donors. And if you don't think you can buy influence, call me. And in walked Lieberman, who had seconded the nomination for McCain. So this would have been 2012. And I looked at Harry Reid. I was talking to him and I said, "Hey, tell him he's in the wrong room," because we were a gathering of Democrats. And Reid didn't crack a smile. He said, "Don't ever say that again." And at age whatever I was, 60 something, I felt like a 2-year-old. So if you want to look to blame someone for the predicament, start with Harry Reid. Do I think they'll get their nominee? Yes. And what do I think the political ramifications of that might be? I think we're going to get a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate. Now, I know the Senate's tough, but I think it's going to arouse the Democrats in ways even greater than we see right now. It gives us something beyond, as Democrats, and I hope I don't offend anybody but Republicans, it gives us something to say that we'll do in the future and not just hate Trump, which, by the way, is my main motivation. I don't hate him. If I don't hate him personally, I hate him for what he's done to democracy. We're going to pack the court if Biden takes over. And what I would suggest, and I have suggested to some people I'm talking to, that we would have to add 4 votes if the Republicans get their nominee. They'll have a 6-3 majority, with Roberts kind of a swing vote, but not necessarily. So we would have to add 4 votes. That would give us 13 justices and a 7-6 majority. But at the same time we do that, at the same time, if we are wise, we will also reinstate the requirement of a supermajority. At least we will be guided by that much principle and make it impossible to use the nuclear option again. So what do I think is going to happen? I think they get their nominee. I think that it helps us politically. But here's my concern. If we don't pack the court, if we don't add justices to the court, we have a problem. It's the very problem that sent Roger Williams fleeing from England and the church state. We will have a court heavily dominated by religious rather than legal views. Justice Roberts is wrong. We do have Obama judges. We do have Trump judges. We do have Clinton judges and Reagan judges. You can tell how people are going to vote almost every time, not every time, how judges are going to vote by who it was that appointed them. The great disappointments in the past included the great Earl Warren, appointed by Eisenhower, who called Warren the biggest damn mistake he ever made. And why? Because of Brown v. Board of Education, an opinion that Justice Warren wrote. But when, and please remember this, when Nixon got his appointment because of Fortas's taking a bribe, when Fortas was forced from that court, it changed the course of history, and that such is how history is made, not a small event. I'm being signaled by my friend. I'm not going to, Abbott, tell me your name again.
It's Abhishek.
Abhishek.
Yes.
Forgive me. I have not met anyone named Abhishek before, but I have now. I'm being told 10 minutes is up. Tell me in about another 15 minutes, I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to bow out for 0.2 of a second and ask my wife to bring me some coffee so I don't sound hoarse. And I'll be right back to talk to you about the lawsuit that we filed against President Trump, Postmaster General DeJoy, and the United States Postal Service. KB, can I have some coffee, please? Thanks. I want to tell you a story about how this case came about. I have a friend, some of you may know, in Houston named Terry Richardson. Terry was the only person who stood up for us at Catherine's and my wedding 29 years ago. We're very close to her. She told us that during the March primaries, and mind you, this is before March 3rd, before coronavirus was identified as a pandemic. She told us that she went to her precinct, a school, I don't know which precinct, precinct 33, and stood in line for 2 full hours, resting on a cane. Terry is not disabled, but has a disability, just debilitating arthritis. She's had, I think, 2 knee replacements, a shoulder replacement, and it's a dreadful illness. So she stood up on her cane, and it took her 2 hours to get inside the schoolhouse, where one of the people in line, who happened to be a teacher at that school, found a chair for Terry. She sat in the chair, and a guy behind her pushed her the rest of the way for a full hour until she got inside to vote. So she was absolutely committed to voting in the upcoming runoffs in Houston. And that would be on, thank you very much. And that would, does this count as an or an In April, she applied for her absentee ballot. In Texas, mail-in ballots are called absentee ballots. I don't know why. But she never got the absentee ballot. She was obviously committed, totally. Someone is writing that was an well, I don't care. She absolutely was committed to voting absentee, and especially during the pandemic. And on July 14th, it was that the runoffs rolled around. She still hadn't gotten her absentee ballot. So she was forced into a constitutional Hobson's choice. She either stayed home, stayed safe, stayed well, and didn't vote, or risked her life by casting her ballot. She chose to cast her ballot. The line wasn't as long, but at the height of the pandemic, I think that's when Houston peaked almost. Whether it was the peak or not, one should not have to risk one's life, and that of those you come in contact with, that person comes in contact with, simply to cast a vote. It should be an unfettered right under our Constitution. Terry told us this story. I woke up of a Thursday and heard Trump say that if he lost the election, it would be because it was rigged. And he also lied again about the widespread voter fraud in mail-in voting. I'd read enough studies to know, there's only about 2 or 3 studies, but I'd read them. Voter fraud in mail-in voting, whether it's direct mail-in voting or absentee ballots, is statistically insignificant, almost non-existent. The study that I read most recently studied the results from 2000 to 2010. And there were 495 cases of voter fraud out of something like many, many millions. I don't remember, but it was statistically insignificant, as I say, and virtually non-existent. I'd had my belly full. I was really sick of what Trump was saying because I knew what he was doing, as did any sophisticated listener. He was setting the groundwork. He was laying the groundwork, prepping the zone, as the doctors say, for a contest of the election if he lost. No matter how little or how wide the margin, he's going to unleash with bars. I'm reading, I'm being distracted by all these messages by someone who said you don't have to be that sophisticated, and then put LOL, which I understand to mean either lots of love or something else. Anyway, I was sickened by what he was doing, because overall he was undermining voter faith, sanctity and integrity of the vote, and laying the groundwork to try to steal the election. Now, I've talked at great length, and I don't have enough time to talk at much length as I would like to, but let me suggest that if you want more detail about the lawsuit, which I'm going to describe in a minute, to billmoyers.com and look for a headline about the lawsuit. I was interviewed by Moyers for about 36 minutes, and it got into more depth than I'll be able to get into today. So I called on my team. I called on a couple big law firms to help me. They didn't respond, but I called on a team of our lawyers at Berg and Androfi at my law firm to help me with this case. In short, we allege a conspiracy between Trump and DeJoy to, in essence, weaponize the United States Postal Service in an effort to steal the election, to undermine faith in the vote, and to do it in particular ways. DeJoy, who is a walking conflict of interest, if you've read anything about him at all, for instance, he owns $30 million worth of stock in the company he retired from, which does business with the Postal Service. And that business has increased since he took office. So there's enough reason to suspect this guy going in. What are his motives? He also shorted Amazon stock, which he could cause to fall. He did it with options. So you just looking at this guy, he's a walking conflict of interest. And as soon as he took over in June, he initiated and accelerated planned changes at the department that inevitably, predictably, caused on-time delivery to go into a downward spiral. There are 2 in particular I want to tell you about. The first, and I'm sure you've read about these. The first was that he removed hundreds of high-speed mail sorting machines that sort flat mail, like what? Ballots. That caused part of the slowdown. The major cause was that he froze additional hiring during a pandemic that had taken out thousands of USPS, United States Postal Service workers, delivery men, processors, people who collect the mail. He froze hiring and instituted a ban, no matter what he says otherwise, and now he's trying to backtrack, a ban on paying overtime, and a rule that required trucks to leave the docks right on time every time. There's no better way to synthesize the harm this did than in an email that DeJoy himself sent to the 630,000 employees of the Postal Service. In it, and this came in August, in it, he bragged about the extraordinary and undeniable improvement of on-time delivery of mail. Now, there's no question that that delivery time had been in a downward spiral as soon as he got into office. As soon as he took over in June, you could just see the on-time delivery with their metrics dipping. They can't even deny it. Not even dipping, plummeting. In his email, he bragged about this incredible increase from, I think, 83 to 94% on-time delivery. I'm a little off on the numbers, but the fact remains that he achieved this great improvement because trucks left the dock and left the mail behind. In other words, the trains ran on time, but the trains were half empty. Some of these mail trucks were empty altogether. So the question is not about on-time delivery, but on-time delivery of the volume of mail. So that was one of his head fakes. The other head fake, if I can digress a moment, was his announcement as soon as there was public outcry and a threatened congressional hearing, which did take place. As soon as that occurred, DeJoy announced that he was, quote, suspending the changes that he had accelerated and instituted at the Postal Service. And what did that mean? And that gets us to the heart of our case, which has only gotten stronger. It meant that he was going to bake into the Postal Service the very changes that caused the downward spiral, of delivery of mail, that caused Terry Richardson, one of our main plaintiffs, and 3 others to never receive their absentee or mail-in ballots, that forced them into that unconstitutional choice I mentioned between staying home, staying safe, or going to the polling place and risking your life to cast your vote. That's unconstitutional. I don't think anyone would argue that that at least creates an undue burden on the right to vote. Well, other lawyers had the same idea I did. Janet Malcolm once wrote, she was a well-regarded, extremely honored reporter for the New York Times, once wrote, after going through a defamation case herself, where she was the defendant, wrote very generously of the man whom she had written about and who had hurt her, whom she had hurt, said very derogatory things about the man. Lost, she won, and yet she had compassion for everyone, including the judge in the courtroom. She concluded, lawyers, good trial lawyers, she said, have to be good haters. I disagree with her. Good trial lawyers have to hate injustice. And when I had my idea about filing suit, at least 7 or 8 other groups of lawyers had the same idea, because now there's something like 8, 9, or 10 of these lawsuits around the country. Now I'm going to get to the holding in the Washington State case, where the Attorney General filed and recently won a preliminary injunction stopping the Postal Service from pursuing any further changes and reversing what they've done in the past. Let me read to you one part of that holding. Now, remember, we in our suit, which is filed in the federal district court in Washington, D.C., in the court of Judge Emmett Sullivan. And just for your edification, Judge Sullivan is the same judge who refused to accept the Justice Department's corrupt attempt to dismiss the case against General Flynn, who had already pled guilty. In my 52 years of practice, I've in every kind of case, from civil to criminal case that you can imagine, I've never seen the Justice Department pull any stunt like that. Here's what the court in Washington, D.C., in the state of Washington, in the Eastern District, the federal court of Washington said, although not necessarily apparent on the surface, at the heart of DeJoy's and the Postal Service's actions is voter disenfranchisement. And that's what this is about. This is evident in President Trump's highly partisan words and tweets. The actual impact of the changes on primary elections that resulted in uncounted ballots. The complaint of our four clients is a little different. It is that we never got to vote. We never got the absentee ballot or the mail-in ballot to begin with. Two of our clients actually did vote. Yes, Terry Richardson, as I told you, risked her health to go down and stand in a long line to vote. Another of our clients did, in fact, request and never receive an absentee ballot, but happened to have been ordered back home to Wisconsin by her boss, and did vote, but just by happenstance. One other person, the person I'm going to tell you about in a moment, asked for an absentee ballot, and he was working out of state, never got it, never got to vote. And the final person, a New York resident, could not vote, did not receive her mail-in vote, and couldn't vote because she lived with her 85-year-old grandmother and was afraid of exposing her to coronavirus. So the judge goes on to say that this is evident not only in Trump's tweets and partisan words, the actual impact of changes on primary elections that resulted in uncounted ballots and recent attempts and lawsuits by the Republican National Committee and President Trump's campaign to stop the state's efforts to bypass the Postal Service by utilizing ballot drop boxes. Go take your ballot and drop it in. You don't have to go to the polling place. As well as the timing of the changes. What I say is Trump proposes and DeJoy disposes. Trump complains about mail-in voting, falsely again, and DeJoy institutes changes that make mail-in voting appear to be futile. Here's what I want to get to. It is easy to conclude that the recent Postal Service's changes is an intentional effort on the part of the current administration to disrupt and challenge the legitimacy of upcoming local, state, and federal elections. And listen to this, especially given that 72% of the decommissioned high-speed mail sorting machines, the ones that sort ballots, were decommissioned, were located in counties where Hillary Clinton received the most votes in 2016. Seems pretty calculated. Seems to want to undermine the very counties, or at least hold down the vote in the very counties that Hillary took. One of our clients, who is from Philadelphia, which is Philadelphia County, which is where Philadelphia is located, did not vote. He was the one who was out of town and never got his absentee ballot. Now, I wonder why. As it turns out, Philadelphia County voted 84.5% in favor of Hillary Clinton. Terry Richardson, who never received her mail-in ballot, lives in Harris County, which voted 24.5 points better than Trump. I may be a little off in the numbers, but the point, don't you agree, is the same. This is a calculated effort to hold down the vote, to create groundwork for election contests, and to steal the election if Trump loses. And if he does, I may become a believer. I don't mean that. Honestly, I really don't. Can't happen. Let me tell you that greater than having weaponized the Postal Services with the help of DeJoy is the omnipresence that looms in the background, Attorney General Robert Barr. And this is what really terrified me. And anyone who thinks about this should be concerned. President Trump, as you know, actually suggested, standing on a tarmac in a battleground state, that voters, his voters, ought to vote by mail-in or absentee ballot, and then go and vote again at their local ballot box, at their local polling place. Well, as I'm going to, excuse me, I'm going to digress to what I said before. You don't have to be sophisticated to know that in this country, it's one man, one vote. That's pretty simple. And Bob Barr, asked by Wolf Blitzer whether he agreed with the president or if he thought that was illegal to vote twice or to try to vote twice, Barr said, well, I don't know. I don't know the state law. The answer to that is, of course, it's illegal. And if you want to put words in Barr's mouth, he said, the president's speaking metaphorically. He's joking. Who knows? It wasn't serious. It couldn't be serious. But instead, he vacillated. He lied. He said, I don't know. Of course he knows. And what does that mean? It means that this man, Barr, who in my view is a Christian nationalist, all you have to do is read his speech to Notre Dame and the Federalist Society to understand he sees control of this country slipping away from white people and is, I think, terrified of it falling into the hands of people of color. He is the greatest threat to democracy, even greater than Trump. Mark my words. After this election, they will, at the Justice Department, Barr will deploy teams of lawyers to contest elections. And I'm being corrected to say white Christians. My wife, the theologian, would agree with that. The greatest predictor of bigotry is in direct proportion to belief, to fundamentalist belief. And unfortunately, it cuts across. The study was not made of Jews, but the book that she's referring to, that my wife refers to, was a study of only Christians and their beliefs and the correlation between fundamentalism and bigotry. And I'm probably threatening your 501c, so I'll get off of this now. I take all of that back. If this is ever reviewed by the IRS, I did that totally on my own. But Barr troubles me. And as a result, enlisting the help of a lawyer who formerly fought for George Bush during the 2000 contested election, was in Florida. We've got great insight into what the Republicans will do after the election. Now, they are going to be heavily armed. The Justice Department has, God only knows, I think 12,000 lawyers. The FBI has 12,000 special agents. So we're going to have to fight after this election to preserve democracy. And
All right. Good. All right. Welcome back, everybody. I think we've got everyone back now. Oh, 1 second. All right. Welcome back, everybody. We've already gotten a couple questions on Facebook. So I want to go ahead and start with those. Sergio on Facebook actually had a question kind of on one of your preamble that you had, David. What caused Reid to use the nuclear option, or at least what was his rationale? Do you know?
He was running into hyper opposition among the Republicans to Obama's nominees, and he felt pressed to do it, which brings me to another topic. I loved Barack Obama. I thought he was a wonderful president, except he really let us down on judicial appointments. They just didn't seem to matter to him. I once was at a fundraiser with Senator Leahy, who was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and said that he recognized the problem. It had to do with first of all, Obama's inattention. And also, and I'll make this very quick, he left judgeships open when he should have been jamming through a lot of liberal judges and justices, and he didn't do it. But that's why he felt that's why Reid resorted to the nuclear option. It was short-sighted, in my opinion.
All right. Let's see. Does anyone have a question here in Zoom? All right, Bob and Debbie. You should be able to unmute yourselves. Go for it.
Where does your lawsuit stand right now?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Where does your lawsuit stand right now?
Good question. The current status is that the judge is going to decide if we can have what's called expedited discovery, if we're going to be able to take depositions. And as I said on that Moyers interview, I would give anything to cross-examine DeJoy. It would make me a very happy man and bar. So we'll know about that soon. The judge is then going to decide whether the case can proceed for his first decision on the papers, not an evidentiary hearing, but an argument in the papers and maybe oral argument, whether or not to issue the same sort of preliminary injunction as the judge in the Eastern District of Washington issued, reversing the changes and stopping the changes at the Postal Service. So at the end of the month, our judge has been slower to act, which surprised me, than other judges. We're not scheduled and probably won't be scheduled for an evidentiary hearing where we would be able to cross-examine witnesses until the end of this month. So the question then arises, which case has the best chance of getting to the Supreme Court first and actually seeing some changes? And I would think it would be this preliminary injunction issued in the Eastern District of Washington. Back at you.
Okay.
And then Ami has a question. Can the PO actually make up for time lost? And I'm assuming you mean post office?
Post office. Yeah.
Good question. What's happening is a 2 or 3 day delay of mail as it stacks up on the docks, left behind. And what we see is there's a statistician that was hired by another law firm in another lawsuit, but in the same court as us. And the statistician's conclusion is that those 2 to 3 day delays at the end of the period just before the election on November 3rd can cause hundreds of thousands of ballots to arrive too late to be counted. So there is, I think that's the strongest fact that case brings to the court. I hope that answered your question.
All right, and then we have a question from Paige. Go ahead and unmute. One more time, Paige.
Okay. I just wasn't clear on exactly where the court is that you filed your lawsuit in.
It's in Washington, D.C. It's a federal court, and it's Judge Emmett Sullivan. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
One of the reasons we chose that court is that among the appellate courts in the country where we know this is headed, the D.C. Court of Appeals is among the more liberal. And if Justice Roberts truly believes that there are no Trump judges, no Obama judges, no Clinton judges, as I said before, he's wrong. And it's a little bit of healthy forum shopping that led us to D.C.
All right, and I believe, Samia, you have a question as well?
I do. Thank you, David. That was really a very moving presentation, because I found myself literally hugging myself, thinking, oh dear God, what have we gotten into? But I'm wondering, as a many of us are retired. what do you need done that people like me, like us perhaps, can do for you and for your, what do you need? What do you need to make this happen?
Well, I'll tell you an interesting story. We got a call from the Brady Gun Control Group. I've forgotten the exact name of it. And they are now broadening what they do, and they're called the Brady Organization. There's no mention of gun control. They have lined up help from a major law firm for us. We were working, if you can imagine, my wife, who hasn't practiced in 30 years, joined the team. And it was actually, I'll digress a moment, it was actually because of Catherine that we were able to bring the suit. We decided to scrub the suit down. But the quick answer to your question is we're covered for now. But thank you so much. If you want to do something, come join us when we go to Maine to knock doors. And well, I don't know how political I should be, but you know the hand wringer I'm referring to. We were running this case by a noted legal scholar whose name I won't tell you his name, but he's brilliant, well known, and he said you have a problem with what is called standing. For the non-lawyers, have you been injured? Are you the party to bring this suit? It's a very difficult issue, and he said, you're complaining about your clients who've not yet been harmed. How do you know they won't get their ballots for the fall? And I don't think you have a lawsuit. And then Catherine said, look, I've got this friend, Terry Richardson, and she told him the story. She said, we've got 3 or 4 people that we can bring on board who didn't get their ballots, who were harmed in the spring, and it's predictable. You have to prove that there's imminent harm in the fall elections, that the same thing's going to happen. And the constitutional scholar said, that's it, you've got standing. Now that's been fortified, but by what I told you about, I'm going to correct something I said. Our standing is fortified by this finding of the court that 72% of the decommissioned mail sorting machines were in districts, counties that Hillary carried. And I just looked at what happened in Harris County, and the trend is interesting. Bush carried it, W carried it by 10%, and then then he began to carry it by smaller margins, or Republicans did. Obama carried it by a couple percentage points. Hillary actually got 160,000 more votes than Trump in Harris County. And that was the 24.5%. She got 60%, 36% of the vote. So it makes sense that they would shut down the voting machine here. That's the sinister part that I think we can prove. But again, thank you for your offer of help. If you'd been here a couple of weeks ago, we'd have flown you up to where we are and put you to work, but because we were exhausted. It reminds me of one thing that I've resisted for 30 years now. My wife actually is smarter than I am, which really pisses me off. I just have to concede it. I see LOL again. It was already spelled out for me. I have a 22-year-old daughter. I know what LOL means. I like to say lots of love because it irritates me that anyone would substitute an acronym for actually laughing. But that's just me.
All right, we have another question from Eric. Would you be satisfied with acceptance by postmark as a measure to address the slow delivery? Now I don't follow the question. Are you asking if I would be satisfied if all election mail was treated as first-class mail? Let's see. Eric, if you want to unmute yourself to clarify, but I think he's referring to when the post office indicates that they've received your mail as opposed to the delivery date. If that were...
Yeah, I get it. The most states require that the votes be postmarked before the election, before the day of the election. What Trump has sought to do in court is to limit how late those votes can be received. He's lost so far, which is another case that where the judge demanded to know, as a basis of his lawsuit, you give me evidence, he said to Trump's lawyers, of fraud in mail-in voting that would cause me, the judge, to say, no, we're not going to extend this voting. They submitted 500 pages of gibberish, and the judge recently held there is no proof. He's offered no credible proof of voter interference. So would I be satisfied? It depends, because the state's laws on when a vote is to be counted vary so much. In the spring votes, in the primary and runoff votes, tens of thousands of votes arrived too late to be counted, but were postmarked prior to the date of the election. So, no, I don't think I'd be satisfied.
All right, and I know we probably have a couple more questions, but I think that's about all we have time for today. But I really want to thank you for being here, David. Appreciate all that you're doing. It's very much so very important, especially, obviously,